I rise today with a heavy, heavy heart. Like all British Columbians, I was horrified to hear reports of an unmarked mass grave on the grounds of the residential school in Kamloops. Although there are no words that can describe how that feels for survivors, words, it seems, must be spoken. And today, this House has an opportunity to look back over the history, the tragic history that is not just a moment in time, but a live history of our situation here in Canada and here in British Columbia. Because for survivors of the residential school atrocities, they live it every day. Their children are also living it, and their grandchildren are living it. It is not something that happened in the past. It is something that is going on right now. And the events in Kamloops over the weekend bring that home graphically to all British Columbians, all Canadians, and indeed the international community. Survivors most assuredly feel grief, they feel heartache, and they feel outrage. Children taken from their homes and sent to who knows where without any notice and told they could not speak their language, they could not practice their culture, oftentimes beaten, oftentimes sexually abused. Impossible to imagine in 2021, yet that is the history of the residential schools in our country. The Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2007 led to the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which in 2015 made 94 calls to action. Many of them are in the letters, the mandate letters of ministers on this side of the House, as they were in the mandate letters of the previous government. They're there because these calls to action are not just a nice thing to do. This is the least we can do to try and do what we can to make amends for a period in time that lives with us to this very day. I still remember the first time I heard a residential school survivor speak in public. I was with my colleague from the Nanaimo North Cowichan. We were in the Coke Silas School just south of Duncan here on Vancouver Island. And an elder got up, and it was a gymnasium. There were kids running around, there was lots of noise, there was a moment of celebration. But when the elder got up, you could feel the energy in the room change, because every person in there, young ones, other elders, everybody, knew that we were going to hear a story that needs to be passed down, not just for this generation, but future generations, about what happened in Canada with Indigenous peoples. When I heard the story, I made a commitment at that time to do everything that I could. As a student of history, I have 2 degrees in history, and I did not know about the atrocities of residential schools from our public education system, from 2 universities. I did not know. I learned it in a gymnasium from a survivor, talking to his kids and his grandkids about what he had suffered. I had the honor to be invited to Lower Post when I became Premier by the Casca, the Tahltan, and the Taku River Tlingit, to be urged to work with them to get the federal government to knock down the last vestiges of the residential school in Lower Post. And I heard stories there. 2 elders, particularly, one who could not join us in the basement because he could not walk down the stairs one more time, to relive one more time what had happened to him in that building. At the time, the federal government thought it was a perfectly serviceable building, no need to replace it. Fortunately, the federal government has changed their mind. And on this National Indigenous Peoples Day, my colleague, the Minister of Indigenous Relations, and I will be going back to Lower Post at the invitation of the Casca, the Tahltan, and the Taku River Tlingit to knock down that building. And although I was very much looking forward to that moment, it has materially changed as a result of the events in Kamloops this past weekend. Because it is not just a moment in history, as I often revert to protect the emotions that we all have when we think about our children being torn from us by the state, sent to who knows where, to be told to be good white people. Yet unimaginable to us today, yet a very active part of who we are as Canadians. On the 21st of June, when I go to Lower Post to do my part to knock down the history of residential schools, I'll be remembering the Kamloops and the Secwepemc who have vowed to the people of British Columbia and to Canada, that they will determine who is there, how they passed away, and pass on those regrets back to the communities that were affected. Courageous move by those two nations. I thank them for the burden that they've taken on. But I want all of us to live with that burden, because that's also the least that we can do. Our children were not taken away from us. Our children were not told to not be who they were. That happened to someone else. But our responsibility as legislators is to make sure that the calls to action, hard fought, are the least that we can do. And on National Indigenous Peoples Day, if you have the good fortune of being in a community with Indigenous people, if you have the good fortune of having a relationship with elders in those communities, sit down, hear a story, and be reminded of the living history of Canada. We're a proud people. We've done extraordinary things together, but we've also done atrocious things together. And collectively, we have a responsibility to face that head on. And after the discovery of a mass grave in Kamloops, it's more real now than ever before.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Premier, for those words. I rise today with a heart filled with grief. Last week, the member for Kamloops South Thompson and myself were left speechless as the news that the remains of 215 children were found buried at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. By all accounts, 215 children whose deaths were undocumented. 215 children with the indignity of an unmarked grave. 215 families who will never be told what happened to their child. How do you put into words what the Kamloops people, and indeed all Indigenous people across our province and country, are feeling right now? In the past few days, many of us have remarked that there are no words, as the Premier referenced as well, to describe this horrific discovery. But we must find the words. We cannot continue the silence that allowed this to happen in the first place, that continues to impact generations of Indigenous families in so many ways. We must find the words, and we must take action. We must reaffirm our steadfast commitment to meaningful reconciliation, and survivors must be heard, and we need to work to find them closure and some peace. We can never forget or ignore the 215 children who lost their lives. Each death is an irreplaceable loss for an Indigenous family. Each person mattered, and unthinkably, thousands more also remain lost. Honourable Speaker, I want to say a word about the people in my community in Kamloops where this tragic discovery was made. I need to acknowledge the Kamloops people and their strength through this difficult process of confirming their worst fears. Cookbee Roseanne Casimir called it a knowing in our community, a feeling that sat heavy in people's hearts for many, many years, until it became a stark reality last week. Taking on this work, knowing the probable and very painful outcome, has been and will continue to be no easy task. Yet Cookbee Casimir and her council are providing strength to all in Secwepemcúlecw. The Kamloops Secwepemc Language and Culture Department conducted this careful work with the help of ceremonial knowledge keepers who ensured cultural protocols were being upheld. They have also been careful and sensitive in the way they have shared this news of the discovery with the community, the media, and the public, because they know how hard this news will come to those who lost loved ones and those who are still dealing with the effects of residential schools. Despite the deep heartbreak and grief felt by many, they are continuing their work on the site, because last week's findings may only be the beginning of the story. I want to thank them for their perseverance and their strength in the face of such tragedy and loss. Kamloops has an interesting history, Mr. Speaker, with Canada when it comes to Indigenous issues. It was 1910 that the Laurier Memorial was signed in Kamloops. Here we are 111 years later, and still no action on that document. Indigenous communities want to see action, Mr. Speaker. It has long since passed. It is incumbent on all of us in this chamber to listen and support the Kamloops Secwepemc in their efforts to ensure their cultural protocols are followed as they work to provide their lost children and their families the dignity of a proper final resting place. This loss is felt by all British Columbians and all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. We all have heavy hearts today, and we must work together in a good way to heal these painful wounds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise today to respond to this ministerial statement. Today, my family and the entire BC Green Caucus team stands with our relatives in the interior. We wrap our arms around them in love, we share their tears, and we let them know that we're here for them. Today, I stand in this House to honor those who lost their lives in the residential school system. The words that I'm going to speak today aren't easy, and they are direct. Like many of my peers, my grandparents, my great-aunties and uncles are survivors of Cooper Island Residential School. I know that they'd want me here today, honoring the horrors that they lived through by demanding accountability for them. The resounding story that I heard from Indigenous leaders this weekend is that this is the beginning. We know in our hearts this is the beginning. For the last several years, our Crown governments and society believes that it has been doing the work of reconciliation. After all, many of these stories have already been shared by residential school survivors through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What needs to be addressed here is our response, specifically the urgency in our reaction to what has been and what is being uncovered. It's not that we haven't done anything. We've started the work. But have we really moved as quickly as you would expect after hearing these horrors? We know that if these children were not Indigenous, but rather European, that we would not have been slow to act. I see on social media my friends and colleagues sharing graphics agreeing that all children matter, yet deep down we know that in our society it's just a fact. In Canada and British Columbia, some children matter less. We know underneath the shiny, happy facade of Canada and British Columbia, there lurks a grotesque and shameful past. For 30 years, my relatives have been sharing their experiences from these despicable institutions. For 30 years, those stories have been hushed. Our relatives have been told that Canadians and British Columbians don't want to hear their stories. They've been told to stop lying. They've been told to stop embellishing. There was a statement from this institution that noted the unimaginable proportions of this tragedy. And this is an incredibly unfortunate characterization of the situation that we carry. For Indigenous people, this story is not shocking, nor is it unimaginable. This is the trauma our families have carried for generations. When people ask me what our problem is, why don't we pick ourselves up? They haven't wanted to hear the answer. As we continue to grapple with missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, hanging red dresses in recognition of our current reality, what is uncovered in Kamloops is the stark reminder that this storyline is not new. It has been in the imagination, indeed in the nightmares of our relatives for the past 130 years. It is the terror that our ancestors have lived with. The only reason to call it unimaginable would be because these institutions, these Crown governments, federal and provincial governments, people that populate these chambers in the past either haven't been listening to our stories or they've cared less, because it is a reality in our country that some children have mattered less. These are both terrible considerations. There is nothing to imagine for those who have been paying attention. Our elders, our families have been sharing the grim details of their experiences in residential schools for decades. That is the record of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You don't have to imagine it. You just have to believe it and care enough to act with the urgency that you would if it was your child that didn't return home from school. It's your kids going to school, not coming home, not being there when their parents are there to pick them up for Christmas, after the headmaster of the school so graciously allowed them to go home for Christmas, if their parents could find their way to go and pick them up. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, is often associated with saying, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man," end quote. Joseph Trutch, whose name is on a plaque right outside that door, British Columbia's first Lieutenant Governor, following Confederation, is quoted as saying, "I think they're the ugliest and laziest creatures I ever saw, and we should as soon think of being afraid of our dogs as of them," end quote. As historian Robin Fisher wrote extensively in Joseph Trutch in the Indian land policy of Trutch's role in dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their lands, he did it quite extensively. Residential schools were a critical tool for the process of killing the Indian, in Scott's words. And deliberately breaking up families by forcing children to residential schools, it was a tool to expedite the process of dispossessing Indigenous people of their lands and resources. RCMP, church officials, and Indian agents would show up to Indigenous communities and forcibly remove children, taking them to these deplorable institutions. There have always been stories in our families of our relatives that didn't come home, the children that died and were buried there with little or no notification to the families. Unfortunately, even as our society has evolved and is more receptive to hearing and acting on these awful stories, this provincial institution continues to be responsible for unacceptable outcomes for Indigenous people. I wish I could say that Indigenous children are no longer forcibly removed from their communities. However, I can't. I wish I could say that Indigenous people were not dramatically overrepresented in fatalities at the hands of police, the criminal justice system, homelessness, suicide, addictions, and drug poisonings, all statistics you don't want to ever be overrepresented in. The accountability that I talked about earlier needs to be in this chamber as well as outside. Our provincial government must accept responsibility for the role that this Crown institution played in this reprehensible history. This is work that should be advanced by all parties in this chamber. Work that could be done by the Select Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs. Let's find ways to engage Indigenous leaders as an assembly to inform our work, because what we're doing is not enough. We cannot wait for the federal government to act. We must believe the survivors. We must stop referring to what we know like we didn't know it. We must stop pretending it was better than it was. We must stop acting like we came by this wealth through honest means, because we did not. This land and the resources this Crown government depends on came from the dispossession of Indigenous people. For decades, this provincial government has benefited from the lands and resources that were secured through residential schools and other disgraceful policies. In honor of those children buried in unmarked graves, in honor of our families who had a child who never came home from school, we must make those resources immediately available for trauma and healing services. All resources needed to restore our languages immediately available. All resources needed to restore our houses of culture and governance immediately available. It's time for the representatives in this chamber to stop saying how we can't do this and start finding ways that we can do it. I'm so grateful for the incredible public response to this tragedy facing our relatives in Kamloops and the interior. I'm grateful for the demands from our family and friends and neighbours to ensure that all children matter. And we can honour those calls by ensuring government responds as if it were our child that didn't come home from school. This is indeed a heavy burden, but is one we can make all lighter if we carry it together. Ait Kasiyam. Thank you.
Members, I want to say thank you. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you.